This content is recorded exclusively for Dr. Young's anatomy class. It is not to be uploaded or distributed to any social media sites or streaming sites, and not to be used without the permission of Dr. Young. Welcome to Chapter 26, Reproductive System. In this chapter, we're going to start off with a quick overview of some definitions and then look at the difference between meiosis and mitosis. And then we're going to look at the male reproductive system and then the female reproductive system. So looking at meiosis. So at the beginning of the semester we looked at mitosis. Mitosis is what a everyday normal somatic cell, which is just a normal body cell, uses to make new cells. So if a cell gets damaged, it just gets old, breaks down, we need to make a new one, we use mitosis to make an identical copy. Meiosis is going to be used in our sex cells, our sperm and our egg. These won't be identical copies from what we started with. They're going to have half the amount of DNA, and that DNA is actually going to be mixed up a little bit. So hopefully we're not actually making just identical clones of ourselves. We pass on those better genes and keep the species going. Looking at some definitions. So when we're looking at gonads, we're looking at the primary sex organs. These are going to be testes for males and ovaries for females. Gonads not only produce our sex cells, which are sperm and egg, they're also going to produce sex hormones like estrogen and testosterone. Gametes, these are the sex cells, so these would be the sperm and egg. This is what we're going to make using meiosis. And then we have accessory reproductive organs. These are mainly going to be glands that are going to contribute fluids to the reproductive tract. During meiosis, like we said, this is going to be for those gametes, for those sex cells. Mitosis was for our everyday normal cells. This is going to be accomplished with fertilization. So we have to have a sperm that fertilizes an egg to make a zygote. That, when those two combined, that then gets us our whole 46 chromosomes. So when we started, the egg has 23, the sperm is going to have 23. And then, once we combine those together, then we have our full set. The whole point of meiosis is to have half the number of chromosomes. So remember, somatic cells have 46. They're going to be considered diploid because they have that full set. Meiosis, or sex cells, are considered haploid, H-A-P-loid, because they only have half the number. Now, half of these are coming from paternally, from the father, and half's going to come maternally from the mother. They're said to be homologous chromosomes. Homologous just means the same. So they're going to come in pairs. So we get half from mom, half from dad, but they're actually going to come in identical pairs to each other. These are going to form up and form our different alleles. So for instance, if you're looking at a chromosome from mom and a chromosome from dad, you're going to get half of those genes or half of those alleles from mom for, say, height, and you get half from dad from height. Or you get half from mom from hair color and half from dad for hair color. Now, some of these genes end up being dominant, some end up being recessives. If those genes are dominant, those are the ones that you actually see because those are the ones that get expressed. So if mom has brown hair, that would be dominant over dad's blonde hair. So you end up with brown hair. So it also depends, even though we get some from each, mom and dad, and they're going to be pairs with each other, it depends which ones are dominant and which ones are recessive on which ones actually get expressed. Here's a chart actually going through the whole process of meiosis. You're going to see it's extremely similar to mitosis. We still have prophase, metaphase, anaphase, and telophase, except there's two different divisions. You have meiosis 1, and then you're going to have meiosis 2 in the next slide, which is basically going over all the steps again. The major differences between mitosis and meiosis, here in mitosis 1, if you look on the left in mid to late prophase 1, there's crossing over of genes. So actually some of those genes from mom and dad actually cross over and we kind of mix them together. So it's not identical copies of the DNA anymore. The second big difference is that in meiosis 2 at the end, we're not going to make a copy of our chromosomes to start with, and we just split them up in half. That way, in all of our different cells, we only end up with half the DNA. So here's meiosis 2. Meiosis 2, you still go through prophase, metaphase, anaphase, and telophase. This is where that second big difference came in. We don't make a copy of the chromosomes in prophase, or starting in interphase, really. Since we don't copy them, when we pull those chromosomes apart, when we get to our final cells, there's only half the amount of DNA. So that's what we want to end up with, is just half that amount. And here in this slide, it's just comparing mitosis and meiosis. It has everything we just kind of went through written out for you on the differences between the two. Okay, now we're going to look at the male reproductive system. Okay, to start off with, we're going to look at the major pathway. So we always kind of start at the testes, because these are the male gonads. This is what's going to make the sex cells, which are the sperm. So the testes are housed within the scrotum. They're going to produce a sperm, which is part of the semen. So semen isn't just sperm. It's actually mainly other fluids from glands, and the actual sperm is just making up a small amount of it. So when we look, starting at the testes, they're found within the scrotum. Wrapping around the testes, we're going to have the epididymis. Now, once we make the sperm in the testes, they actually go through an entire big long tubing system. The epididymis is going to be part of that tubing system that wraps around the testes. It then is going to lead up into the ductus deferens or vas deferens. Either one's correct. It's going to go up around the bladder and then turn into the ejaculatory duct, which goes through the prostate gland, and then turn into the urethra that will be the exit that leads out through the penis. So that's our big major pathway. For our accessory glands, for male, we're going to have the seminal vesicle, the prostate gland, and then the bulbourethral gland. When we look at the testes, they're going to be composed of a whole bunch of different lobules. Within these lobules, and a lobule is just a lobe, basically, is going to be seminiferous tubules. These are just going to be a whole lot of small tubes winding through the entire testes. What's going to happen at the very start of these tubes, this is where the sperm cells are actually going to be made, and then they're slowly going to mature and work their way up to the epididymis. Now the testes are also going to be producing testosterone for the male, which is going to be a big hormone for muscle growth, for sexual reproduction, sexual drive. In females, we still have testosterone, but estrogen tends to play a bigger role in both sexual drive, muscle formation, and some of the big things that we see happen during puberty. But we're going to have both testosterone and estrogen in males and females. So when we look at the testes on cross-section, we can see that the testes is split up into different lobes, and we can see those small seminiferous tubules going through each different lobe. This is basically set up as a defense system. If one lobe of the testis gets damaged, then hopefully the other lobes are somewhat isolated and they'll be okay. You can also see all these little tubes leading up into the epididymis. The epididymis is just continuing the tubing system. You're going to have the head, the body, and then the tail that eventually turns into the ductus deferens or vas deferens. Another thing that you can see on this picture is blood supply going down to this testis. The blood supply to the testes are completely separated from each other. So the left and right testes get their very own blood supply. This here again is a protection mechanism. So if one testis gets infected, hopefully the other one will be okay because it has its own blood supply. Also within the scrotum, there's actually going to be connective tissue that completely separates the two testes from each other. So there again, if you have complete separation, if something happens to one, it gets damaged, it gets infected, then the other one hopefully is going to be okay. Epididymis, like we said, this is just continuing that tubing system from the testes. This is going to be a storage area and a place for the sperm to actually mature before it goes up the vas deferens or ductus deferens. So we saw the head, body, and tail in the last slide. So like I said, just continuing that tubing system. The ductus deferens, this is also called the vas deferens. Vasectomy, when a male has a vasectomy, if they don't want to have any more kids, then this is a tube that gets cut. So this is a tube that's going to wrap up around the bladder and make its way around to the ejaculatory duct. During a vasectomy, males still make semen. So all the fluid is actually still there because that's coming from the prostate gland, the seminal vesicles, and the bulbourethral gland. The only thing that's not included in it anymore is going to be the sperm. Because if you cut that tube, the sperm just can't make its way up into the ejaculatory duct anymore. That sperm, the body will naturally just break it down and actually just recycle all the components and will use it other places in the body. The ejaculatory duct. This is a really compact area with a lot of things going on. So this is where the sperm will make its way up through that tubing system. This is where we find the seminal vesicle, we'll find the prostate gland, and we'll also find the urethra starting here. The urethra is essentially the exit to the body. There are different sections of it. You don't need to memorize the different sections, but we do have a prostatic urethra that runs through the prostate, which females don't have. Then we have membranous urethra that's going to go through an external urethral sphincter. Then a spongy urethra that's going to lead to the external urethral orifice, or just the opening that's going to be in the glands of the penis. So it does have several different sections. Don't worry about the different sections. So when we look at our picture here, we start with the testes, then we go up into the epididymis. The epididymis is where that sperm is stored and it can mature. Then it's going to work its way up the vas deferens or ductus deferens into this kind of ampulla area. Ampulla is just a widened out area. This is going to be a widened out area of that ductus deferens or vas deferens where the sperm is actually kept or stored until it's time to ejaculate the sperm. Once it's time to ejaculate the sperm, then those sperm will actually, that ampulla will contract, there's some smooth muscle in there, and get the sperm into the ejaculatory duct, and that's where we can have ejaculation actually start from. Right in that area of the ejaculatory duct, this is where you have your seminal vesicles, which will create some of that fluid for the semen. You also have your prostate gland, and this is also where the urethra is going to start. Urethra is going to run through the penis, and then we have our external urethral orifice, which is just going to be the opening to that urethra. Also attached right after the prostate gland, those are going to be those bulbourethral glands. They're also going to contribute fluid to that semen. When we look at the penis, we have an external penis and the internal penis. External penis, we have a root, body, shaft, the glands of the penis or the head of the penis, and then we're going to have foreskin. The prepuce is also the foreskin. During a circumcision, this is the part that would actually be removed. Internal penis. We have the corpora cavernosa and the corpora spongiosum. These are basically going to be different areas of spongy tissue that will fill up with blood as the penis starts to get erect. The corpus spongiosum is the section that the urethra is actually going to run through. So it actually doesn't fill up with as much blood when the penis gets erect because you don't want to completely basically clamp off that urethra because you still want that semen to be able to make its way through there. So when we're looking at the internal penis, we do have dorsal arteries and veins that run through it. Within the corpora cavernosa, so the two big spongy tissue tubes that run on either side, we have two deep arteries that run through each one. This is going to be the main erectile tissue. So essentially what happens, this is a spongy type of tissue that as it fills with blood, it actually becomes erect. If you look down towards the bottom, the corpora spongiosum, that has a urethra running right down the center. So this section is also spongy tissue, also becomes erect, but not so much so that it's completely going to squeeze off that urethra area, as we do need that semen to still make its way through there. Looking at our accessory glands. So we've mentioned these along the way, but our first one is going to be our seminal vesicles. So seminal vesicles, this is going to be found in that area connecting to the ejaculatory duct, also where we have that prostate gland. Seminal vesicles are going to make seminal fluid. So this is actually making up 60 to 70% of the actual semen. Seminal vesicle is what makes most of it. This fluid is going to be made up of fructose, which is just a sugar to make ATP, prostaglandins, which actually stimulates smooth muscle contraction in the reproductive tract, and then coagulating proteins and enzymes that actually kind of help to clot the semen together. It can also help to neutralize the pH in the female reproductive tract when the sperm actually do get there. Prostate gland is found right around the same area as the ejaculatory duct in the seminal vesicle. We only find the prostate gland in the male, we don't find it in the female. This is going to be making up 20 to 30% of the semen volume. Here again, it's going to have a sugar that's going to be used for ATP production. We also find it making prostate-specific antigen. This is something that's sometimes tested to see if a male has prostate cancer or possibly prostate cancer. However, what it's used for normally is actually to dissolve the clot of semen once it gets into the female reproductive tract so the sperm can make its way on up the female reproductive tract. It also has some antimicrobial chemicals there again to help to fight off some bacteria any sperm may come across, and it also helps to neutralize that pH in the female reproductive tract. Our last gland is the bulbourethral gland, also called Cowper's gland. Bulbourethral is what you're going to see most often. This is mainly a pH neutralizer. So our other two glands also produced a fluid that helps to neutralize pH, but this essentially is about all this one is doing. This can also provide some lubrication, but it's a big pH neutralizer. Overall, when you take all the fluid together with the sperm, that's what makes up our semen. So it's not just sperm, it's all those fluids actually coming together. Capacitation is something special that happens with the sperm. So sperm don't become fully motile or movable, or they don't completely swim until capacitation happens. Capacitation, in order to get the sperm to actually start swimming and make their way all the way up the female reproductive tract, it first has to come in contact with those fluids that we find in semen. The second thing that has to happen, it actually has to come in contact with fluids of the female reproductive tract. So capacitation is getting that full mobile sperm that can swim out the female reproductive tract, but you have to have both fluid from the male reproductive tract with semen and also fluid from the female reproductive tract to get that process to start. So we looked at that prostate gland in males. It can cause quite a bit of problems. BPH, benign prostatic hyperplasia or hypertrophy, is a problem we see in a lot of males. That prostate gland will actually start to swell and increase in size. It doesn't necessarily always have to be a cancer. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. But if that prostate gland starts to increase in size too much, it can actually start to squeeze off that urethra, and then males have trouble urinating, especially. They'll urinate smaller amounts more frequently, and it's going to be harder. They have to increase the pressure to get that fluid through that smaller tube. Now, looking at things that aren't necessarily part of that reproductive pathway, but they do help to support all those structures. So the scrotum is basically a supporting structure for the testes. The rathe is going to be a visible line that actually will indicate where that connective tissue separates the left and right testicle from. And then we have a couple muscles actually surrounding the entire testes helping to support them. we're going to have the dartus muscle, and then a cremaster muscle. These are going to actually help to raise and lower the testes to help to control temperature. Sperm are very picky on being produced if it's too warm or too cold. We want an ideal temperature to produce sperm. So that muscle can actually raise the testes up closer to the body to warm the testes up, or lower them further away to actually cool them off. So those muscles are going to be pretty important to the actual production of sperm. Now, wrapping around the entire structure, whenever we're looking at those muscle layers, whenever we're looking at the scrotum, we actually have what's called spermatocords. Spermatocord isn't its own structure. It's actually several structures just all wrapped up together. So we're going to have our muscles, that cremaster muscle, and that dartus muscle. We're going to have an artery, a vein, a nerve, lymphatic vessel, all going down to that testes, and it's all wrapped up together. The ductus deferens, vas deferens, is also wrapped up in there with it. That's what's making up that spermatocord. So when we look at our picture here, so that spermatocord, you can see the ductus deferens wrapping around from the bladder going down to that testes. You can see an artery, you can see a vein, you can see the layers of muscle wrapping around that eventually encompasses that entire testes down there. All of those vessels are the spermatocord. Those have to go through the inguinal canal. The inguinal canal is basically the opening where the blood vessels, where that vas deferens can all lead down into the testes, and it can lead back up into the body. This is actually going to be a little hole in connective tissue that we have running up and down that inguinal area, which is where the leg actually meets the body. This is where inguinal hernias can come from. So sometimes if you look up by the urinary bladder, we're going to have some small intestines that can actually sneak down in here. If those intestines, if that pressure increases in the abdominal cavity, you can actually push some of those intestines down into that inguinal ring or that inguinal canal area. That's what causes an inguinal hernia. This is what we check on sports physicals. So when we tell someone to turn their head and cough, we're checking to make sure intestines haven't snuck their way down into that inguinal canal or that inguinal ring. If intestines do get down there, then they can actually be strangulated, cut off the blood supply, and we can actually have intestines die, and that's not something we want. Then you have a mess. Good thing is, it's usually extremely painful, because if you cut blood supply off to anything, you generally have pain with it. Surgery can be done. You can actually push the intestines back up into the abdominal cavity and then close off that inguinal ring so it's not quite as big, so those intestines can't slip through there anymore. But inguinal hernias are relatively common. Alright, now we're going to look at the female reproductive system. When we look at the female reproductive tract overall, there's going to be some similarities but a lot of differences between the male and female reproductive tracts. When we look at the female, we're going to have our ovaries, which are going to be our gonads. So that's going to make the gametes, which are our eggs. The uterine tubes, these are going to lead to the actual uterus. And then the vagina is basically going to be our entrance and exit. We also have a lot of supporting structures that we're going to look to when it comes to the female reproductive tract. A lot of different ligaments. You don't need to memorize the names to all the ligaments, but I'm at least going to show you how it's set up and supported. So, when we look at the overall flow of how the female reproductive system is set up, we always start with the ovary. From the ovary, we're going to go up into the uterine tube or fallopian tube, and then it leads down to the uterus. The uterus is going to lead down to the vagina, and that's going to be the exit for the body. Now, something you can see really well here, the urethra is not part of the reproductive system for female. In the male, it actually plays double duty. In the female, the bladder and the urethra are just part of that urinary system. They're not part of the reproductive system. When we look at some of these ligaments, we have suspensory ligaments, we have broad ligaments, we have ovarian ligaments. There's a ton of different ligaments supporting this entire female reproductive system here. Mainly because we have to have areas that hold the ovaries up, we need support for those fallopian tubes, you need support for the actual uterus itself. So it's a little bit more spread out than what the male reproductive system is. Now, one thing we don't have to worry about as much for females is the actual gonads being externally from that body. So testes are actually external. In females, ovaries are protected internally, which is actually a better setup. When we do look at the ovaries, like we said, these are the gonads. They are going to produce the eggs or ova. Hormones, they're going to make a ton of different hormones. Estradiol, estrone, estriol, progesterone, inhibin, relaxin, a lot of different hormones. Estrogens, the first three are different types of estrogen. So estrogen, progesterone are probably going to be the two most common ones you hear over and over again. These are going to be really important here again for sexual maturity, muscle production, sexual drive. Still have testosterone. Testosterone is still produced in females. It's just estrogen is a little bit more important. When we actually look at the cross section of the ovary, we do have a cortex, which is the outside, and the medulla, which is more the middle. The cortex is where we see the actual eggs mature, turn into follicles, and get ready for ovulation, or basically being pushed out of that ovary. The medulla is where we find blood vessels, nerves, lymphatic vessels, everything supplying the ovaries with what they need to actually keep going. Here's your ligaments actually written out for you, the same ones we looked at on the picture. You don't have to memorize these, but I just wanted you to kind of see how much support structure there is in the whole reproductive system. Uterine tubes or fallopian tubes. A lot of times we use fallopian tubes. Either one are fine. These are going to surround each ovary. They're going to have several different sections to them. The isthmus is found at the end of the tube. This is the part that actually connects to the uterus. The ampulla is going to be at the other end. The ampulla is actually going to have a kind of funnel to it called the infundibulum, which has little fingers called fimbriae. These actually help to sweep the eggs or the ova up into the fallopian tubes to get them down into the uterus. So when we look at our entire setup, so you can see the ovaries. The ovary has those little fingers stretching over it. Those are the fimbriae of the fallopian tube. They lead to the ampulla. The ampulla is then going to lead into the actual tube until we get down into that isthmus. Now the infundibulum, it's going to be helping to make up part of that ampulla and also where the fimbriae are attached. So we kind of have a lot going on right there real close to the ovary. Essentially, all this entire section is doing, the little fimbriae, the fingers, the widened out infundibulum that leads to the ampulla, this is all just to sweep the eggs up into those fallopian tubes. Because we don't want an egg to go outside of the reproductive system. We actually want that egg to stay within so it can make its way down the uterus, so in case we do have fertilization, then we can have implantation. It can actually implant into that uterus. Now, another good thing that you can kind of see on this picture is going to be the different parts of the uterus. So the fundus is going to be kind of the top rounded section. Then you have the body, and the cervix is going to be the entrance and exit to that uterus. We're also going to have different layers to the uterus. Endometrium is a very inner layer. The myometrium is a middle muscle layer. And the perimetrium is going to be that outside connective tissue layer. You can see that really well in this picture. Ovulation. Whenever we ovulate an oocyte is also good, just another word for an egg. This is where those fimbriae come in, and they want to sweep that egg up into that fallopian tube. Uterus. So we looked at all the different parts on the picture. We have the body, the fundus, and the cervix. This is where implantation happens. So in case we get fertilization, we get implantation in the actual uterus. And here's your different layers actually written out for you, the same ones here again we saw in the picture. So we got that parametrium, that very outside layer. We got the myometrium, this is smooth muscle. We have the endometrium, which is the very inner, basically just epithelial layer making up that inner lining. Also for the uterus, a ton of connective tissues. So we saw it with the ovary and the fallopian tubes. We're going to have a cervical ligament. We have uterosacral ligaments. We have round ligaments, broad ligaments, a lot of ligaments. You don't need to memorize all the different ligaments, but here again, I just want to show them to you. So here with the uterine ligaments, you can see all of them. The broad ligament is actually a nice big broad one that's going to help to connect the fallopian tubes with the uterus. The ovarian ligaments connect the ovary to the uterus. The round ligament is actually going to go around the actual uterus. A lot of connective tissue around this entire thing here. Also, same picture, you can see all the different layers of the uterus. That perimetrium, myometrium, endometrium. You can see how thick that myometrium is. This is why uterine cramps are so intense and so strong. When that uterus contracts, it needs enough muscle to actually push babies out. So that's a lot of smooth muscle. So when cramps do occur, they can be really, really strong and painful. Vagina, entrance and exit basically to the uterus. So it's going to be the entrance for sperm. It's going to be the exit for the menstrual cycle, for basically that endometrium being sloughed off from that uterus, and also the exit for the baby. So when we're looking at the vagina, so it's underneath the uterus. Cervix is the entrance and exit to that uterus. And whenever pap smears are performed, we're actually getting samples of that cervix. So we're basically wanting to prevent cervical cancer. We're wanting to make sure to check for certain diseases like the papillomavirus and make sure that that cervix is in good shape. Vagina is basically a muscular tube. It has rugae in it, so it can actually expand during childbirth. We saw rugae in the stomach, we saw rugae in the bladder, we see rugae here too. Basically just entrance and exit for that uterus. The vulva is a general term for where we find the external genitalia. Mons pubis is actually just a fatty area that lays above the pubic symphysis. Labia majora is going to be protective outer folds of skin. Labia minora is protective inner folds of skin. The vestibule, this is going to be basically where we find the opening to the vagina. This is going to be the part protected by the labia minora. We're also going to have paraurethral glands that actually sets on each side of the urethra, because we're also going to see that urethra exiting in this vulva area. Greater vestibular glands. Both the paraurethral glands and the greater vestibular glands are basically going to secrete a mucus that is used for lubrication during intercourse, and it's also basically going to be helping to stabilize that pH also in coming from the male reproductive tract and actually going into the female reproductive tract. The clitoris is where we're going to find the erectile tissue in the female. So this is going to be similar to actually the spongy tissue in the male, where it still actually becomes erect and fills up with blood. This is where the nerve supply is actually located in the female. So the majority of nerves and sensation is actually located in this clitoris. For the male, it's more in the glands of the penis, is where we find most of that nervous supply going to. So when we look at our picture here, vestibule area is mainly what we're looking at here. Mons pubis, fatty area that sits right on top of the pubic symphysis. We're going to have the labia majora, the labia minora. Within that labia majora, that's where we find the clitoris. We also have a clitoral hood that is actually made up of the labia majora that helps to protect that clitoris. We have the urethral opening right up top. Underneath the urethral opening, we have the vaginal orifice, or the vaginal opening. And if you look on either side of the urethra, we're going to have those paraurethral glands, and then on either side of the vaginal opening, we actually have the vestibular glands. So these can produce mucus. They're, again, help for lubrication and also help for pH stabilization. All right, looking at mammary glands, which is also part of the female reproductive system here. Main job of the mammary glands is actually milk production for infants. We have a lot of connective tissue and a lot of ducts that go along with the mammillary glands that we're going to see. Areolars, of course, nipples. This is where the milk is going to be exiting. A lot of different lobes. So 15 to 25 lobes that will actually have different tubes. The lobes basically are just areas support the tubing system, the ducts that will eventually lead to the areolar, into the nipple, where we can get that milk to the actual baby. A lot of suspensory ligaments, a lot of connective tissue that will help to connect the entire structure together and help to hold it in place and stabilize it. When we look at the ducts, they're lactiferous ducts. Lactation, lactate, it's all milk production. So these lactiferous ducts will basically take the milk and get it to lactiferous sinuses where it will accumulate until we eventually have stimulation for that milk to exit out of the actual tubing, that duct system in there. So when we take a look at our picture here, we can see our entire breast tissue. So there is a lot of fatty tissue. There is a lot of connective tissue with those suspensory ligaments that basically help to support the entire tubing system. And you can see that this fatty tissue and connective tissue will actually extend all the way up into the armpit. So this is why we have to be super careful during breast exams to check for lumps and bumps all the way up into that armpit area. The other thing that we find a lot in the armpit is lymph nodes. This is why breast cancer can spread relatively easily if one of those cells get up into those lymph nodes, because that breast tissue runs up into the armpit, then it can have access to the entire rest of the body, and we hopefully want to prevent that. When we look at our different lobes, the breast is actually kind of set up a little bit like a testes. We have our different lobes that are made up of our different tubes that will all eventually lead to one place. So kind of similar setup that we see here. But here, instead of making sperm, they're of course making milk. So we're going to have all of our lactiferous ducts that lead to our lactiferous sinus. This is going to be collection area of the milk that will eventually lead to that nipple, which will be the exit to the body. And on the right, you have some blown up pictures of those actual ducts in there. If these get blocked, which can happen, it can freak people out, and rightfully so. If there's an infection if one gets clogged, you start to have inflammation. If you start to have inflammation, you start to have swelling. If these lobes start to swell, or these ducts start to swell, it becomes a lump. And we've been programmed, if you feel a lump or bump, you need to have it checked out and make sure it's not breast cancer. Something that you tend to see with clogged or infected tubules or lobules, though, these are generally warm to the touch. They usually have inflammation going on with it, so they're usually warm to the touch and really painful to push on. Now, some breast cancers can also be painful to push on, but generally, if it's warm to the touch, it's really painful. Whenever pressure is applied to it, then it tends to be a blockage or infection of these tubules rather than breast cancer. Not always, but most of the time. A lot of times warm compresses, some antibiotics will clear it up, and then people will be good to go. But it is super scary. All of a sudden, maybe breastfeeding baby, and then a lump all of a sudden appears. So it does scare people. We do see quite a bit of breast cancer, mainly because this is a really active area of the body that goes through a lot of changes, especially pre-pregnancy, during pregnancy, and post-pregnancy. So whenever you have a lot of change in tissue, when it's really active and not as active and really active, we do see more types of cancers pop up in those types of tissues. So that's why we do see it in breast cancer relatively often.